Okay, great. I think we can go ahead and get started, and we can start with a standard introduction while people might continue to join the room. So welcome everybody. This is another talk in our animal law and policy series. My name is Jeff Sebo, and I direct the Animal Studies MA program at NYU. And I am joined by my colleagues, Becca Franks and Mari Roberts, who organize these events with me, as well as our distinguished guests, who I can introduce in just a little bit. So just to give you all a little bit of context for this event is hosted by NYU Animal Studies. NYU Animal Studies is a program at New York University that studies what animals are like and how humans and non-humans interact, and the moral and social and political and economic and ecological and aesthetic, et cetera, significance of animals and our interactions with them. And we have an undergraduate minor and a graduate MA program and various public events that you are all welcome to join whenever you like. And you can join those events by signing up on our email list. You can go to the Animal Studies website and join an email list there. And actually we have, I guess I get to say, another event on Monday at noon, a panel on my new book, Saving Animals, Saving Ourselves, with Kendra Coulter and Doug Kaiser, and I am really looking forward to that discussion. So you might consider RSVPing for that one as well if you like. And then we have plenty of other events too that you can consider joining. And this is part of the Environmental Studies department, and we do lots of those same things regarding environmental studies. And we also have a Center for Environmental and Animal Protection that puts out policy reports and other kinds of interesting reports that might be of interest for academics and advocates and policymakers. So that is a little bit about us. And then I should also thank our sponsor for this event, the Brooks Institute for Animal Rights Law and Policy. They very generously have sponsored all of the talks in this animal law and policy series. So thank you as always to them for their continued support. Okay, now, here is how our event will go today. I will in a moment introduce our speaker, and then she will give a wonderful talk for some period of time, maybe 40, 45, 50 minutes, give or take. And during that time, you can all be writing down questions or comments in the Q&A tab, not the chat tab. Write your questions or comments in the Q&A tab. And you can upvote other questions or comments in the Q&A tab. And then when we come to the discussion portion of this session, Becca will read questions and comments to Kristin in the order in which they are upvoted, more or less. So if you want a question or comment to definitely be delivered, you can increase the probability of that by upvoting. Okay, so that is the format. I can now introduce our speaker. So Kristin Andrews is York Research Chair in Animal Minds and Professor of Philosophy at York University. And she was elected to the College of the Royal Society of Canada in 2015. Her research is at the intersection of philosophy, social cognition, moral cognition, and animal cognition. She is the author of several books, including most recently, How to Study Animal Minds, an argument for rethinking methods in comparative psychology, and The Animal Mind, second edition, which I teach every year in my Animal Minds class, a survey of how empirical work on animal minds can help to inform debates in the philosophy of mind. Andrew serves on the board of directors for the Borneo Orangutan Society Canada, which has the mission to promote conservation of orangutans and their habitat and to educate the public. She is currently writing a book on social norms, animal culture, and the consequences of recognizing other animals as members of communities with their own normative structures. And she will today be giving a talk to us called Why Animal Culture Matters for Animal Welfare Policy. So Kristin, thank you so much for joining us, and feel free to take it away whenever you'd like.
Thanks so much, Jeff, for that very nice introduction. And thanks, Jeff, Becca, and Mari for inviting me to give this talk today on Earth Day. It's very nice to be doing that. I'm going to share my screen so I can, you don't want to see that. How's that? Can you see my screen?
Yeah, I can see your screen. Looks good.
Okay, great. So I can talk to you today about why animal culture matters for animal welfare policy. I've been very excited about this idea of animal culture. That's a burgeoning, probably one of the most exciting burgeoning areas of science, of animal behavior and cognition in the last 20 years. Animal culture is something that was just really entered into the Western scientific framework about 20 years ago, with this idea that animals also have cultures. And now today, 22 years later, we have evidence of culture across the animal kingdom. We have evidence of culture, and by which I mean socially inherited patterns of behavior and information, including group-specific traditions. I'll get more into that in a bit. But we see evidence of culture in a wide variety of non-human animals, including in humpback whale song and in humpback whale migration routes, in arbitrary social customs in chimpanzees. We see it in tool use with capuchin monkeys, and vocal dialects in songbirds, such as the savanna sparrows pictured in D. We also see culture in the choice of what to hunt, who to hunt in baboons, and predator recognition in sticklebacks and minnows who learn to fear pikes from other group members. We also see culture in fruit flies with their preferences to lay eggs in the same substrate that they observe group members doing. And we see it in bumblebees who learn how to pull these cool discs in order to get a sugar solution from observing other bumblebees engage in this behavior. So when animal culture was introduced as a topic in Western science, this was in a paper in 1999, it was quite like this shocking discovery that chimpanzees have culture. In order to get to this point, scientists from a number of different wild chimpanzee sites across the continent of Africa collaborated and shared their data about the behaviors that they were observing at their at each of their sites. And what this large-scale collaborative project found was that there are about 50 different cultural behaviors that seem to exist in some groups, but not in other groups. So this isn't just a chimpanzee behavior, but it's a Mahale chimpanzee behavior, or a Gombe chimpanzee behavior, or a Thai forest chimpanzee behavior. So some examples of chimpanzee culture would be things like handclasp grooming. So this is a style of grooming one another while you're holding hands up in the air, and only seen in some communities and not in others. Or behaviors such as using a anvil to crack your nuts on, and maybe using a wedge under that anvil in order to steady it when you're cracking the nuts on top of it. Some communities have anvils when they crack nuts, some don't. Some communities of chimpanzees don't crack nuts at all. So you see this wide diversity of behavior across these groups. So I said that culture is understood as socially transmitted patterns of behavior or information. That's the most inclusive sense of culture used in the literature. And central to this broad understanding of culture is the idea of social learning, right? That we acquire, an individual acquires these behaviors from other agents, from watching what they're doing. And some of the earliest work in social learning and culture in animals actually happened a long time before the idea of culture made its way into Western scientific thinking. So the behaviors of Japanese macaques watching potatoes is a behavior that was spread through this community of Japanese macaques and led Japanese primatologists to postulate culture like 50 years before it was accepted in the West. But there's also this narrower conception of culture that refers to group-specific traditions. And this is the part of the definition up there that's in the brackets. So these would be traditions are socially transmitted patterns of behavior and information that are common to members of a group, but differ between subpopulations of the same species. And that's what we saw in the case of the chimpanzees, that they had these differences between the different groups, and that these differences are not ecologically based. It's not that, oh, there are no rocks in this community, and that's why we don't see chimpanzees cracking nuts, or there are no nuts in this community, and that's why we don't see chimpanzees cracking nuts. No, they had all the materials they needed, but they weren't engaging in the behavior. Another element of culture is that the social learning that occurs might be selective via social learning biases. So if you're going to imitate another individual, you might want to imitate an individual who's good at the task, who's a good nutcracker, who's an adult. You don't want to just imitate anybody. And we see these kind of social learning biases in human social learning, biases towards things like copying the majority or copying individuals with higher social status. And that's the sort of thing we've been seeing in the chimpanzees as well. So alongside this really exciting area of research, it started with the chimpanzees, and now we see it, across mammals and birds and fish and insects. We have another theory that intertwines with culture, and this is a theory called dual inheritance theory. It's a theory about culture not just existing, but serving as a secondary inheritance system for groups of animals. This idea that genes and culture co-evolve, and that alongside genetic inheritance, where we're passing on our genes, we also are passing on our behaviors through this process of social learning. And that's the cultural inheritance. And we get that from our society, right? We don't need to be genetically related to someone to have a cultural inheritance from the other members of our society. But genetic inheritance and cultural inheritance are intertwined in very important ways. So in humans, we see, for example, lactose tolerance is an example of gene culture coevolution, how the fact that humans who lived with animals and started drinking animal milk evolved to tolerate the lactose that was in that milk. And you don't see this among human populations that didn't live with animals in this way. So human herders were creating their own niche, their own ecological niche that they then evolved to fit to. Other examples in humans would be humans who dive for crustacean hunting, evolving increased lung capacity, or also fire in our hominid history, fire users evolving bigger brains. All right, so with these two pieces, like theory accepted, animal culture and dual inheritance theory, some theorists have been arguing that animal culture has some really important implications for conservation. If we want to conserve animals in the wild, what we need to do is not just think about conserving their DNA, conserving them as biological entities, but we also have to think about conserving their culture. And we also have to think about what their cultural needs are in order to thrive, right? So for example, if we're looking at foraging strategies that the animals have been adopting in this community that are problematic, say we see in the case of elephants that they're raiding fruit gardens, and we want to teach them not to raid fruit gardens because you get human elephant conflict in those kind of cases that aren't good for either the humans or the elephants. You need to think about social learning. You need to think about who's going to be a demonstrator in this elephant community that will encourage the other elephants to stop raiding the fruit gardens. We also have to think about culture when it comes to reintroduction programs. So if you have, an orangutan who you'd like to introduce back into the wild because it was an orphan because of the palm oil plantations, its mom was killed, it was orphaned, it was raised as a rehab, and then gets reintroduced into the forest, you have to think about also their cultural needs and not just their biological needs for food. They have to be able to, for example, know where to get the food when the trees are fruiting and so on and so forth. So while there have been some work looking at implications of culture, given animal culture and gene culture coevolution for conservation, There's been much less attention paid to the question of how animal culture matters for animal welfare. And that's what I want to talk to you about today. And I think that there are 5 questions that are really important and interesting that we can address, that I'll address here, on the relationship between animal culture and animal welfare policy. So first, I just want to go through and get on the table, like, what are the goals of animal welfare policy? Like, what are we trying to achieve in order to figure out how to achieve it given culture? And the second question here is, how can animal culture inform these goals of animal welfare policy? The third question is, what does current animal welfare policy get wrong about animal well-being given animal culture? And then to end, I'll look at 2 questions that have been raised regarding animal culture. Do animals have cultures that are valuable like human cultures, right? It might be, oh yeah, it's culture for us, but it's not culture for them. And so none of this applies to animal welfare. And then another question that I'll close on is, should we conserve animal culture? Is there something valuable about it that we need to attend to? All right, so let's start with the first question here. What are the goals of animal welfare policy? Well, the overwhelming consensus right now is that needless harm to animals should be avoided, right? This is something that, regardless of where one stands, they can generally agree to this. But typically, in this agreement, what people have in mind when it comes to harm is physical harm, right? That's the obvious harm. And what I want to suggest here is that there could be other harms that are not being attended to that have to do with culture. Culture creates another way in which cultural beings can be harmed. There are cultural harms. So in human context, I think that we can make this quite clear, right? So cultural harm to a human would be not allowing them to present themselves according to their cultural needs or cultural practices. So like Sikh children who are told they can't wear ceremonial daggers to schools, or people who are told they can't wear headscarves or other religiously important clothing. Cultural appropriation would be another example that is described as a cultural harm. Other cultural harms would be destruction of important cultural sites or cultural objects, mishandling cultural objects, and so on and so forth. So it's very clear in the human case, right, that we can do cultural harm to humans. And if animals have culture, as it seems like we've really accepted they do, then we can explore how captivity creates a context for possible cultural harms to animals too. And these cultural harms are things that we need to attend to, given the consensus on what the goals are for animal welfare policy. All right, so in order to make this point, I want to first describe to you how it is, why we should think that captive animals are also cultural animals, right? One might think, oh yes, sure, the wild animals, they have culture, but once you're captive, you don't have culture anymore. I'll tell you why that's not the right way to think about things. And then I want to go through 3 different ways that prima facie that culture impacts well-being of captive animals. And I'll go through this in a little bit of detail, that you need sociality of the right kind, that you need opportunities to construct culture, and that you need access to the knowledge of your group. All right, so first, captive animals have culture too. What you see on this slide here are pictures of a number of multi-species communities, right? So one of the things that happens once you've got animals in captivity is you have a human or a group of humans who become part of the culture or become part of one of the cultures that the animals are involved in. Of course, we have overlapping communities as humans, right? We have our academic communities and our family communities and our other social bubbles and so on and so forth. When you've got an interspecies lab or zoo or sanctuary setting, what you have is humans and other animals making up a community here. So I have a picture here of the multi-species community at Vine Sanctuary. where you've got species of a number of different varieties living together, but also humans taking care of them. Above that picture is Laurie Santos's monkey lab at Yale. These monkeys in the lab are living with humans that they see every day. And then the third picture is Anthony Key Resort Dolphin Ecotourism and Research Center. And so this is a place where the dolphins also have relationships with humans who take care of them, who they live with, and they also have an opportunity to interact with tourists who come to swim with them. And they can choose to swim with them, or they can choose to go somewhere else in the enclosure where the humans can't get to. So there's already, we see like humans and animals living together in community in these sorts of different communities, but does this count as culture? Is there a way, do we really need to think of this as specific kinds of cultures? And I think that we do. This is because the sorts of evidence that have been used in order to argue for animal culture to begin with, right? So again, this picture of the bumblebees pulling on these artificial flowers, this is the evidence that's been gathered for our culture in bumblebees, right? Some of the evidence. A lot of the evidence used to support the claim that animals engage in social learning and have culture have been conducted, these studies have been conducted with captive populations. So you see below the bumblebees, there's a little graphic of social learning of food preferences in rats. And the other image is a study of chimpanzees learning how to open a box that contains food one way versus another, and the way in which the alpha chimpanzee was taught to open the box is the way that spread through the community of chimpanzees. So this evidence of social learning in these captive animals, when these pioneering studies of animal social learning, sits alongside evidence of social learning in farmyard animals such as cattle, pigs, sheep, and chicken. And it's certainly, I think, premature to say of any species that they don't have culture, because the recent history of animal culture research suggests that we're underestimating rather than overestimating the extent of cultural complexity beyond these kind of high profile cases of the chimpanzees, say, and the whale song. This is in part because you remember that definition, that narrower definition of culture said, well, as long as it's not genetically based or ecologically based, then it could be a cultural behavior, a tradition. But if gene culture coevolution explains some of the animal behavior, then we are going to see genetic bases for some cultural behavior, just like we see genetic bases for lactose tolerance in humans. Right? So we cannot exclude certain behaviors as cultural because of that, without denying that gene culture coevolution is a real phenomenon to account for. So I think we have really good reason to think that the animals, whether they're in the wild or in a lab, are going to be cultural animals. If they're cultural in one place, they're going to be cultural in the other place. So what are the implications of this on welfare? Sorry, I have not COVID. So one of the implications, I think, right away is we have to consider sociality. We have to consider social relationships. Now, this is nothing new. This is something that is a very traditional and understanding of welfare. And Harry Harlow's social isolation experiments with macaques made the need for social contact clear, right? These babies who were taken away from their mom and given a wire mom that gave milk, or a cloth mom toy that didn't give milk would prefer the cloth toy. These kind of maternal deprivation experiments showed that infants need their moms pretty clearly. But what the lens of culture tells us is that it might not be enough to just have your mom or to just have some other conspecific in a room with you. It tells us that the types of social relationships might be just as important as having a social partner to begin with. So then there might be a need for social contact with a range of conspecifics who occupy different roles, for example, who are at different stages of life or have different prestige or expertise backgrounds. While mothers serve as the first point of cultural contact for animals, in many species, same-age peers are really important. We learn a lot from same-age peers as well. And this is true of minnows as well. They learn how to recognize predators from other same-age peers, not from their mothers. In other cases, juveniles might acquire cultural knowledge from same-sex adults other than a parent, as in the case of male chimpanzees who learn how to hunt monkeys from other males who they're not related to or who aren't presumably their father, or female elephants in Africa learning how to signal sexual receptivity in their first estrus. And that's what the picture is here of a non-estrus female who's doing the sexy estrus walk because there's a young female elephant who's never had her first estrus. So there might be information you need to learn from others if you have culture, right? And the others might have to occupy a certain role. But also if you're a cultural being, you might want to share your knowledge. It might be really important that you have opportunities to care for others and to teach others, as in the case of the African female elephants teaching the sexy walk. And I think it's important also to stress that these might not just be true of conspecifics, but this sort of thing could be true of interspecies community as well, right? So an animal that's housed without any members of its species, one might look at this and say, well, this is a terrible thing if you've got a social animal and it doesn't have any conspecifics who they're living with. One has to take into account that the sociality might also exist and the culture and community might also exist with the human caregivers or other non-human animals that are in the area. And that's very important. So I think that the cultural nature of animals requires us to kind of rethink sociality because it requires we consider the type and the quality of social partners, right? Not just sociality, but sociality of the right sort. And then the second, like prima facie way in which culture affects welfare is that if you're a cultural being, you need to express culture. You need to have an opportunity to be a cultural being in one way or another. So if you don't have a culture, you have to be able to have the opportunity to create it. And when you're creating a new community, right? When you're managing animal populations and going to create a new community, you need to think about enrichment, but not just enrichment for the individual, right? Puzzle boxes that an individual can, work on and solve so they're not bored, but enrichment that allows a community of orangutans in this case to create traditions that they can learn, that others can learn by imitating them. So for example, you might want to have multiple same enrichment objects, maybe bags of rice, rice bags, not with the rice anymore, but not just one rice bag. So one orangutan can wear it, but have enough so that these can be cultural objects that others can copy as well. Or if you are working on puzzle boxes, put it in a situation where others can observe, get close enough to watch the individual who's doing the puzzle box, so they can have a turn at it as well. There's evidence that the sorts of artificial challenges that are already presented to animals have excellent, welfare outcomes. They reduce stress level and elicit signs of positive affect in all kinds of species, not just great apes, but also in cows and sheep and so on. And then the third kind of obvious implication here of culture for captive animals is information. What sort of epistemic harms might we do without knowing it if we're not taking culture into consideration? So for instance, when you have managing of a captive population, and you're engaged in regrouping or rehousing, moving individuals from one facility to another in order to promote genetic diversity or something like that. You might remove older individuals who have knowledge about rare or less frequent events, such as death or seasonality, or about caregiver turnover. And by removing that individual, you might significantly impact the overall functioning and welfare of the group, leaving naive individuals to have to start over in their epistemic culture building project. And this is true, certainly, when we look at the lack of cultural knowledge when it comes to reintroduced animals and who don't thrive when they're reintroduced if they don't have cultural knowledge about, say, where the trees are fruiting or what are the traditional navigation routes in this community. So this has been well documented when it comes to conservation. I think that the same sort of things, same sorts of worries might exist in captive animals. And there's some evidence that, housing animals in social groups where they can learn from one another how to do things is good for them. So there's some evidence that housing dairy calves in social groups increases their weaning weights. Why? Because it facilitates their learning of grazing. They're learning how to graze from the older cows in the group. Or chimpanzees who adopt group practices when they're introduced into a new community, they are more successfully integrated into the group. And that's a kind of when in Rome sort of attitude for the chimpanzees as well. All right, so after looking at those three prima facie ways in which culture should matter for animal welfare, you might think that, well, it's just animal welfare can just expand a little bit and we'll be fine if we just think about what we're already doing a little bit differently. That's all we need to do. But I think that also that current animal welfare policies get something a little bit wrong about animal well-being. So let's turn to that next. If we just start by looking at the World Organization for Animal Health's Terrestrial Animal Health Code, we see, what current animal welfare policy kind of looks like at an overall umbrella level. It says an animal experiences good welfare if the animal is healthy, comfortable, well-nourished, safe, is not suffering from unpleasant states such as pain, fear, and distress, and is able to express behaviors that are important for their physical and mental state. And one example of this would be the UK Farm Animal Welfare Council's 5 freedoms. So they specifically say, like, good welfare means you have to be free in these 5 senses. You have to be free from hunger and thirst. You have to be free from discomfort. You have to be free from pain, injury, and disease. You have to be free to express normal behavior. And you should obviously, if you're, if you have good welfare, you shouldn't be engaged in abnormal behavior. That's bad because it's abnormal. We don't like that. And you should be free from fear and distress. Now, I think that we can agree that freedom from hunger and thirst would be a good thing, unless, sometimes some human cultural behaviors that involve fasting certainly would say, well, sometimes you need to have hunger and thirst. Probably this is not a cultural behavior that we see in non-human animals, but you never know. I'm going to put that one to the side, and then let's look at the others though. What about freedom from discomfort? Is that really a value that animal welfare policy should be aiming for? So are there aspects of culture where you're feeling discomfort, fear, and distress, and that it's important even though you're feeling discomfort, fear, and distress? Yeah, I think so. So consider fighting in rats or in chimpanzees or in other species where there are dominance hierarchies. Fighting has direct harmful effect on the individuals who fight, but fighting is also a normal part of how many animal societies work and how interpersonal relationships are managed. So I think we have to be a little bit slower to intervene when we see something that looks like a fight, and not say, we need to stop this fight because this is something that is problematic for these animals. As is in the case when dealing with human beings from other cultures, we need to be careful not to overlook and unintentionally interfere with cultural traditions that have arisen in these captive populations. It might be easy to miss a cultural behavior that actually exists. And we also have to be, we have to not be too quick to judge a behavior as bad just because it's one that makes us uncomfortable or one we don't feel good about. It might be that we don't understand it. So some things like pacing or hair pulling or rocking, these stereotypies, which are usually associated with poor welfare, might in fact be, in one sense, the best way the animal has to manage the situation, where they're getting all that they need from the 5 freedoms sort of context. They're not getting something, there's something that's bothering them, but this is their means of self-regulating. And I think we see this also, and we need to consider this also when we're looking at human children who maybe are sitting under the table at school because the environment is too aversive. They're self-regulating or making choices given their context that are good for them. You have to be not too quick to try to stop a behavior like that, because the stopping of the behavior might be a bigger harm than letting the animal self-regulate. Another example of where there's some distress might be struggling to learn something. Learning is not always easy. And in chimpanzee societies, it can take years to learn how to do things like dip for ants, which is a risky behavior. Ants bite you, and I've seen orangutans, run around screaming because they had biting ants all over them. So it's not easy. It's stressful and fearful, and there's some discomfort that might arise from learning how to engage in some important cultural behaviors. But also, if we turn to pain, injury, and disease, right? I think that also is something we need to be a little bit cautious about making sure animals avoid, because human cultural practices include some practices that involve pain and risk of injury and disease. The practices from tattooing and piercing to open mouth kissing, or sharing food, right? So directly parallel to human cultures, we see certain abnormal practices in captive populations of animals that appear to be cultural in origin. They appear to be socially learned by other members in the group. So one example is chimpanzees who eat feces or smear feces. These are behaviors that might in fact be, even though they discussed the human caregivers, or at least at first discuss human caregivers perhaps, might be an important cultural behavior with some risk of disease, but not a very high risk of disease. And so the behavior perhaps should be tolerated from the perspective of the humans and accepted as this is what these, this community of chimpanzees do, and they're developing their community. Cannibalism in chickens also appear to be socially learned, and clearly has direct negative effect on the injured chickens. The caregivers need to understand the social aspect of these behaviors to control the spread of them and be mindful of the potential negative effects of some interventions, right? So if they're just going to isolate groups of chickens from one another, again, they might create more problems than they were solving. Recognizing an abnormal behavior as cultural might also change our understanding of its relevance to welfare. So Lydia Hopper argues that eating feces in chimpanzees is cultural, even though it's taken to be indicative of negative welfare. It doesn't necessarily have to reflect that. So we have to pay attention to what the behaviors are, but just because they're abnormal and there's a risk of injury or disease doesn't mean it's something that we need to stop. And this is an example of a behavior that's, the image on the picture is a behavior that you see in a wild population of capuchin monkeys, where culture was first identified in capuchin monkeys were in these games where the monkeys would stick their fingers with their long, dirty fingernails inside each other's eye sockets or up each other's nostrils, and they would sway back and forth. And this is risky, right? This is something that is dangerous. But these dangerous games, Susan Perry, the anthropologist who identified this behavior, she thinks these dangerous games served a really important social function, served to help individuals bond. So danger might in fact be quite important part of culture. Now, there are other abnormal behaviors that are not maybe dangerous or risky or anything like that, but that might also seem to some to be problematic. And certainly if you want to avoid abnormal behaviors, and you see chimpanzees sawing wood and washing clothes or paddling canoes, you might think that this is a problem. But what is abnormal for a captive population is not going to be, the idea of abnormal for a captive population assumes that you know what the baseline of normal is for a captive population. And we just don't have that. There's this idea, this notion of abnormality doesn't really make sense. So welfare, I think, beyond the 5 freedoms is something that really needs to be considered. It's not just let's expand our current idea of what might be harmful, but also we have to recognize that harms might also of some sort might also have value. Things that look harmful might have value, might not be harms, if you want to put it that way. And the relevant culture, the relevance of culture to animals is also something that kind of moves the traditional way of understanding animal welfare away from focus on affective states, focusing on animals feeling good and not feeling bad. That sometimes feeling bad is something that is also going to be valuable. So once you've got this idea in mind, you can start looking at the different sorts of harms you might do to an animal that actually doesn't involve negative, like a particular negative affect, right? Not giving an animal an opportunity to express a cultural behavior. They might not know that that they want to express the cultural behavior. They might not want to demonstrate the estrus walk because they don't have any reason to, because they don't have any young juveniles around to show them to. But this could still be a harm to the animals. And this kind of builds on a point made by Susanna Monceau and colleagues, that conceptions of welfare that focus on positive and negative affect miss an extra set of harms that relate to the thwarting of animal capacities. So they discuss the case of social animals who have capacities for empathy and sympathy and are inclined by these capacities to aid group mates in distress. So for example, a sow may feel sympathy for a piglet being castrated without anesthetic, yet be prevented from comforting them. Monceau and colleagues argue that the sow is doubly harmed, first by the negative feelings that go along with her sensing the distress of the piglet, and secondly, by thwarting her caring capacities. So if the thwarting of cultural capacities constitutes a kind of harm that transcends any affective states that may go along with that thwarting, then when we deprive cultural animals of opportunities to engage in social learning and to take part in cultural practices and to play a role in developing and shaping new practices, something of value that's directly relevant to assessing their welfare has been lost. And then there's one other issue about welfare beyond the 5 freedoms that we have to consider when we're looking at creating brand new societies, right? So if we're looking at starting an octopus farm, for example, as has been proposed to do in Spain, what we're proposing to do here is to create a new community of animals who have lived in the wild, as semi-solitary animals for the most part, put them in community, force them to be in community. And we know they can live in community because there are some communities of octopuses, at least some species. And then a new culture is going to be created. And the new culture that's going to be created is going to create a new niche for these animals to evolve to. So what we're doing is, in effect, creating a new type of an octopus, if we do this octopus farming project, that live in a community that I've called octoslum. So in Jarvis Bay, there's Octopus, but if this farm goes ahead, it's probably going to be octoslum. You're going to see a lot of negative behaviors in these octopuses, and you're going to end up creating octopuses that cannot go back into the wild after a few generations because they're going to have lost all the knowledge that they need if they are indeed cultural animals. All right, so this is why I think that the traditional understanding of welfare needs to be rejigged a bit. I should wrap up. But before I do, just two quick kind of worries. So one might worry that, okay, all of this is fine and dandy, but you know what? Animals don't really have cultures that are valuable like human cultures. You know, what we have is, you know, we have art and music and science and philosophy, and they have like learning how to, you know, lay eggs in sand as opposed to on twigs or whatnot. You might say, in order to have culture, you need to have some sort of like a normative psychology, or you need to have social norms. And I think just very quickly, you don't need to have norm psychology in order to have cultures. There's no, in a sense, I've argued, and this is in the last line on the slide here with Evan Westra, there's no particular kind of psychology that you need in order to have social norms in your community. And in fact, animals, as I've argued, likely do have social norms. Culture is suggesting that there are patterns of behavior in place that individuals learn to conform to. And probably this is the most important part, and that still needs to be fully established, but there's reason to suspect that there's some social maintenance that happens in conforming to the group behavior, right? And as we saw in the chimpanzees in the captive context, if they conform to their new groups, they are better integrated into those groups. If they learn the cultural behaviors, people accept them. So the second, so I don't think that we need a norm psychology, and I think that there's probably social norms in non-human animals. What about conserving animal cultures? Are animal cultures valuable, things that we should conserve, like biodiversity? So it's been argued that if biodiversity in animal life is valuable and should be conserved, and culture and biology are inexorably intertwined, then culture and animal life is valuable and should be conserved too. And so remember, dual inheritance theory suggests that culture and biology are intertwined the way a weft and weave is on a rug. You can't preserve one without preserving the other. And since we have already this, UNESCO Universal Declaration on Cultural Diversity, which states that cultural diversity is as necessary for humankind as biodiversity is for nature, there's no principled reason to only extend the value of cultural diversity to humans now that we know that other species are also cultural. So what it is, both that leads us to want to conserve biodiversity, and what leads us to want to conserve human culture should lead us to want to conserve animal culture too. Now, this is not to say that every animal culture is great. This is not to say that every human culture is great, cultural behavior is great, I should say, right? So chicken cannibalism might be a cultural behavior that we still think we should change, just like female genital cutting might be a cultural behavior that we might want to encourage people to stop engaging in. All right, so I will just end with this picture. Culture in a captive context can be valuable and meaningful for animals. And captive cultures shouldn't be dismissed offhand as inferior to wild cultures. Captivity can change a group of animals culturally in such a significant way that they cannot be reintegrated into wild populations, right? We've created, through captivity, new kinds of animals. And these new kinds of animals have their own value and their own culture. We're at a point in animal captivity that there have been generations of great apes and cetaceans and numerous other species, dogs, born into captivity. These captive natives should be provided with the opportunities to create their own cultures that allow them to thrive and that partially constitute who they are. The recognition of the relevance of culture to animal welfare should inform how we think about and seek to improve the welfare of captive animals. Thank you. Oh, let me just say that this paper is based largely on a paper I've co-authored with Simon Fitzpatrick, a philosopher at John Carroll University, that we just found out yesterday has been accepted by Philosophy of Science. And so that's on the slide there too. So stay tuned for that. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you so much, Kristin. This has just been absolutely fascinating. I don't know if you want to stop sharing the screen so we can have the interface like this. So that was just really thought-provoking and novel and super interesting. We've gotten a lot of positive feedback from the audience, including commending you for the photographs that you've included. I think they really have illustrated the points really well, and shown the sort of like complexity and nuance of what's going on with these issues. So we have a bunch of questions to discuss and a lot of interesting lines to explore. So Corey Ratch writes, "Hi, Professor Andrews. I've been an advocate for thinking about animal culture, and it's very refreshing to see such a focused engagement with the topic. I'm wondering about your thoughts on culture and inheritance as it relates to octopus, a species whose mother typically die in the process of them being born and who remain largely solitary throughout their life, yet are recognized as one of the most intelligent species on Earth. Thanks."
Yeah, thanks, Corey. I know. So the octopus is not one of those animals that have been deemed a cultural animal. So the science isn't there yet, and maybe won't be there because maybe they're not. But I think that given what we've known from what we found in some lab studies, that there's social learning in octopuses, and that what we've seen in some of these wild sites like Octopus and Octolantis, or I guess whatever. I guess there are many of them now in Jarvis Bay that have been found, where octopuses are living together in these areas because it's very food rich and there's a nice shell bed so they can make their dens, but they fight a lot. And there's really great video of boxing and social interactions of all sorts. So it might be one of the behaviors is like throwing shells of scallops, and this would be a potential cultural behavior from these communities. If it's something that the octopuses wouldn't do unless they see it demonstrated. So I wrote this piece for the conversation on octopus culture, and people are like, octopuses don't have culture. And I'm like, well, you know, maybe they do. We don't know yet. Are you willing to take that risk and make this farm? That's kind of where it was coming at with that piece. But yeah, good point. Thank you.
And I think it gets back to the point that you brought up in the lecture as well, that, you know, it's not only a vertical transmission of information. A lot of times you see horizontal peer-to-peer, and with a lot of species that we think of as being purely solitary, according to our ideas about how communication happens, turns out that, you know, they could be engaging in chemical communication, they could be engaging in sort of like sonic communication that we're not detecting because we're not, it's not in our frequencies. So I think there's like, it seems like with octopus, this, you know, precautionary principle as relates to their culture would be justified, given that they are so different from us and could be engaging in cultural practices in ways that seems unusual to us, just like everything about them seems unusual to us.
Yeah, exactly. That's right.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, so the next question comes from Anne Merrill, and she writes, I'm wondering about your premise. Is animal welfare exclusionary of animal rights? And that's the question. And acknowledging non-human culture seems to imply personhood. Do you see a distinction here? Thanks for the talk.
Thanks, Anne. Those are good questions. So, and the animal welfare, the context I'm coming from in this paper, in the paper that Simon and I wrote, and in work that we're following up with Lydia Hopper, who is currently head of something having to do with animal welfare, John Hopkins. I don't remember her title, but working with within the animal welfare tradition, we're really looking at those sorts of policy issues. So of course, in the US, animal protection law is quite lax. It doesn't even include all vertebrates. I'm here in London right now. I've been working with Jonathan Birch's team for the last few months, and here while I was here, they released a report that they wrote that the British government commissioned them to write about whether or not there is sentience in crustaceans and mollusks, including octopuses and cuttlefish. And I think the bill is already at the point of royal assent to include all decapod crustaceans and cephalopod mollusks under their welfare protections, right? So it's seeing like this radical difference in these two countries has been super interesting. So there's a lot of work to do, just if we're even just looking at animal welfare in the US context, and the same goes for Canada, frankly.
Yeah.
I don't know, so how that relates to animal rights. I think I would offer it up on a platter for people who are working in from that context. And I'm sure there's a lot of rich stuff one could do with it. The case of personhood is one that, Jeff and I have both worked on. And in this concept of personhood is one that I think admits a dimensionality. That you can be a person of a number of different, have a number of different kinds of capacities or social situatedness or whatnot, and be a person in that way. And I tend to think of like all animals as persons in that way, because they're agents with their own interests and so on. They're just persons in different sorts of ways. So yeah, they're octopus persons and dog persons, and in my way of using that concept.
That's great. That's really helpful. Yeah, it seems like if you pass the bar of culture being important to animal welfare, it seems inevitable that it will be incredibly important also to animal rights. And like at the minimum level, if we have to, if we're only looking at sort of a welfare perspective and it's important there, that's like really, it covers the whole field, it seems like.
I mean, if their account of animal rights includes looking at animal interests, then culture is going to be among their interests. That's just, that just follows. So yeah.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Okay, so then the next question is from Nicola Dillon, and I'm just having a hard time scrolling. Hold on a second. Okay. There are human cultural traditions and you talked about this a little bit at the end, but I think just hearing a little bit more on your thoughts on this would be great. There are human cultural traditions and practices that are pernicious. Are there instances of animal culture that are similarly pernicious? If so, do we have reasons to not want to preserve them? What is it about specific cultural transmission? No, I can't read it again. What is it about specific cultural traditions or practices that make them valuable? Their contribution to flourishing or the very property of being cultural?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that there's a lot of work to be done by value theorists on these sorts of questions, right? And both in the human context and the non-human context. It's not always as straightforward as it might seem. because we have a lot of cultural bias when we look at other human cultures as well. And I want to be cautious of that when it comes to not just human cultures, but animal cultures too, right?
Yeah.
And the analogy that I've been using that I like in order to answer this sort of question is, so we say sociality is important, right? Sociality is really important. This doesn't mean that like everybody's a good friend or every relationship's a good relationship, right? And trying to figure out whether you're in a good relationship or a bad relationship can be a lot of hard work. And I think culture is like that. You need to have culture if you're a cultural being, but what's a good cultural trait to have or not is a more difficult question. Yeah, so that's how I sidestep the particular details of that.
Yeah, and it seems like, just the mere fact of getting culture on the map as one of the factors and variables to be taken seriously rather than, either completely, dismissed or ignored like it was in the 20th century, or deprioritized, or, just seen as being irrelevant. The first step is just getting a seat at the table, and then from there arbitrating about what how it might weigh against other concerns. But that it's so new. It's incredible, like the research that you've covered, and the implications of that research. I mean, it's really taken off. It's really quite astonishing just to think about, when I was being trained, granted it was a while ago, but it wasn't that long ago, in animal behavior, it was completely off the table. Like maybe you would have some references to the chimpanzees as being like this sort of like exception, but it was always sort of with a lot of qualifications. And now we're at the point of recognizing that this is actually probably the default rather than something exceptional.
Yeah. Yeah, it's huge. It's a huge change, and this is why it's so absolutely exciting. And yet I don't think it's been really publicized. I don't think that there's all that much information about it for people outside of, Cultural Evolution Society. Even when you look at like the Comparative Cognition Conference happened a couple of weeks ago, and there's not that much going on about culture. A little bit with social learning, but still it's mostly when people do this work, it's mostly primates.
And the social learning, actually, like some of the first species, is according to my reading of the literature, some of the first species that were demonstrated to have social learning were actually fish. Thank you.
I know, it's awesome, isn't it?
But then thinking through the implications of that, thinking through, well, if there's social learning happening that we can notice in species of fish, and we're so, we're not very, like, we don't spend a lot of time around fish. We don't really, have a good understanding of their body language. And we even noticed it in fish. The fact that animals are learning from each other, how profoundly that impacts, issues related to protecting them, taking care of them, helping them thrive, making sure they aren't harmed. All of the things that you're pulling out in your talk here, but it was, it really, like, it just sort of stopped for such a long time. It got halted at just this observation that they can socially learn from each other. Like, what does that mean about their cognitive abilities what does that mean about what happens if you disrupt the older members of the society for the future of that group of animals? Because that knowledge is going to get lost. And there's no recovering of it. Once it's gone, it's gone. It's not the biology, like the biological parts can stay there, but like once the knowledge is gone, it's not coming back.
That's absolutely right. And that's another thing that's really, really worrying about these de-extinction projects. Yeah. Right? Let's take this DNA of a woolly mammoth and make a woolly mammoth. You're not going to make a woolly mammoth. You're going to make a monster that has no sociality and no culture. Yeah. Nobody like that ever existed before.
No. Yeah. This in complete isolation, not understanding how to be a being in the world.
Yeah. And that just had never existed before. You're not recreating something that existed before. You're making something brand new.
Yeah.
And that needs to be acknowledged. I haven't seen that come into the de-extinction discussions. I think it's
Really?
really important. I haven't seen it.
Yeah, no, that exactly. That's like, that's the whole point. And I think even just, you know, I mean, the closest parallel would be elephants, and they're some of the animals that we know the most about the you know, cultural practices and learning and all of that kind of stuff, and how profoundly important it is for them to have a healthy functioning life.
And how bad it was with the elephant culls, and how it really destroyed the fabric of these elephant communities, how elephants who lost their matriarchs died during the very first drought because they didn't know where the water was. The water hole was that you only need to know where it is every, 15 years or so. And then also just the males being schooled by elder males about, chill out, don't be such a jerk.
Yeah. And that's a great example also of, where you have this horizontal transmission of learning in, it was traditionally thought that the males of the elephant were sort of solitary or semi-solitary, and that the real sort of like place where the social grouping and, then potentially the place for social transmission of information was taking place was with the matriarchal line. And then because we just sort of weren't paying close enough attention, missed this huge problem with the male elephants, that there was culture, there was social learning, there was structure. It just wasn't as obvious to us as outsiders. And that when you disrupt that, it creates huge problems down the line also for human beings, because then they start, rampaging and acting up. So yeah, I think just being a lot more humble about what's possible in other species is, the right thing to do sort of epistemologically, but also, for the sake of the animals, but also like for the sake of the human animals as well.
It's absolutely true. I mean, we have to recognize that we don't know. We always, it's not to say that people didn't realize this after the fact, right? So you do, like, you move someone out of your zoo and then everything falls apart and you're like, oh, I guess that was a bad idea. But, so it's not like people don't know this to some extent, that culture matters or the social relationships matter. But introducing it into the policy and having it be a lens through which you can see the animals, and also a lens that like acknowledges your epistemic ignorance, that I don't know what the traditions might be. I don't know what might be important. That's what I think could be really helpful if that changes.
Yeah, that's great. That's really helpful. Okay, so we have an interesting question here from Michelle Matai. Do mammals have more complex cultures compared to other classes of non-human animals?
Yeah, so that raises a question about what cultural complexity would be. And there are a lot of different ways in which you could define or like describe different kinds of culture. So maybe there's a culture with only one tradition. One might not even want to call that a culture. I don't know that there's any species like that only has one tradition. Again, epistemic, humbleness here. But it might be numbers, right? It's like, so these species have hundreds of cultural behaviors and these have only a few. And this is the sort of thing you often hear discussed when people are saying human culture is so much different than non-human animal culture, because we have so many traditions that governs every part of our life. But I think it's premature to make claims about numbers yet, because we're still just discovering it. Another way in which people talk about complexity of culture is in cumulative culture. And so this idea of cumulative culture is that you've got a cultural tradition that gets tweaked over time, right? So one thing that's often been stressed in discussions of culture is the fidelity of the information transfer to the others in the group. But that's being stressed at the same time that people stress, oh, but you can improve upon things. So there's this interesting tension in the literature there too. My favorite example of cumulative culture is just, you start with a handful of reeds or something to brush the ground to clear it. And then you realize, oh, it would be nice to tie it up with something so they stick together. So that's the next step in cumulative. nature, then you put a handle on it, it's short, and you still have to bend down, and you make it a long handle, right? So then you've got this awesome technological advanced broom. And so there's some evidence of cumulative culture in chimpanzees. It's debated among primatologists whether there's any cumulative culture, but I think that I'm convinced by the sorts of evidence I see in the Guadalupe triangle of these chimpanzees who have tool sets that they use to make tools. So they have a tool that they use to help make a tool that they use in conjunction with another tool in some of their food processing and dipping.
That's fascinating. I didn't know about that. That's great.
Yeah, Cricket Sands and Dave Morgan, their work.
Fantastic. Thank you. Okay, next question. Elizabeth Walsh writes, sorry, I'm having so many troubles scrolling. Thank you for this fascinating presentation. Can you comment on how the possibility to express cultural behaviors may be denied to captive animals? For example, parrots who may have been caught in the wild caught as babies, live as single parents, often in poor welfare without appropriate interaction, however, may still possess an inner drive or need to express cultural expression of behavior. Might such birds develop cultural expression which is intertwined with their current circumstances? And then how would that impact their welfare? Yeah,
absolutely. I mean, I think that that's kind of the point that Simon and I wanted to make about abnormal behaviors, right? Quote unquote, abnormal behaviors, sometimes being great cultural behaviors for the animal. You have to take a look at them, and I don't know what all the details would be. And that's not my expertise is to look at all of those, details for every single species. So I don't really know about, like, if you gave me a specific parrot behavior, I wouldn't be able to know. I wouldn't have anything to say. I have no expertise in that area. But I would say that if a parrot and a human caregiver develop a ritual of some sort or a behavior that they engage in that parrots in the wild don't engage in, that unless there's some other reason to worry about it, certainly, and even if there is other reasons to worry about it, it's probably a great thing, right? And if this is a behavior that could be shared with other humans or other creatures of whatever species that come into the space, that would likely be something that would be promoting welfare for that parrot. I think what would be problematic is to say, oh no, we can't let the parrot do this thing because it's not parrot-like, right?
Yeah.
Like the orangutans washing clothes. If you try to say, oh no, just don't wash the clothes. We're in a zoo, like washing windows. Oh, we don't want our zoo animals to wash windows because the zoo visitors want to see natural animals. That is not for the animals. That is for the visitors, right? And yeah.
There's actually a really nice review by Georgia Mason that shows that within environments, the animals who are engaging in stereotypical behavior, for example, often have other indicators, if you compare them to other animals in the same environment, often show indicators of doing better and coping with the environment better. And then if you make the comparison across environments and you see one environment with lots of stereotypical abnormal behaviors and another environment with less, then it's generally tracks with welfare. But with it just very much supports your way of thinking that within this environment, comparing the animals to the other animals in that environment, the ones who are engaging in some of these abnormal behaviors might actually be the best copers in that situation. And so just blocking the behavior is basically blocking the coping mechanism. And I haven't heard anyone talk about the idea that maybe some of these stereotypical behaviors could be cultural and socially transmitted. And I think that would be a really important way of thinking about them.
Yeah, because like if you're stressed and you find it really useful to rock, and other people in your groups see that and say, I'm going to try that. Oh yeah, that feels good. That's great, right?
Yeah. Okay.
It's like when Temple Grandin introduced to the world the squeezing machine that she had built that made her feel good. And like this was great for people who found relief with this sort of pressure.
Right. Okay, so we have another question about cultural comparisons, and I think we've answered that. And then we have a question from Tucker Kirchberg. To what extent does ecosystem conservation recognize architectural preservation? Does animal culture include built environments?
Yeah, that's an awesome question. Yeah, that's a really cool question. I would hope so. I don't know that it in fact does. I think it's I don't know any jurisdiction that would say we've got to preserve this, termite mound or something like that, or this traditional road. I mean, I wish. I just thinking about the context I know about. So in Indonesia with orangutans, it's very often just, orangutans come here. Maybe they travel through here, maybe they don't. But if we need the space, we're just going to build a road here, or dig a mine or build a plantation. It would be awesome to preserve roads. Like the travel routes are super important for endangered species like orangutans. And attempts to build, these green passageways through habitat that's been separated haven't done all that well in Indonesia.
Yeah. And it makes me think about also just how complex many bird nests are, and that they're sort of not, they were a blind spot in animal behavior for a really long time, and not really seen as potentially tool use or architecture or built environments. And then some researchers started looking carefully at deconstructing them and seeing how much selection and decision making is going on for building them, and how they are architectural products. And and then there's also different species that leave behind structures for the next generation. So there's these wood rats that create these elaborate, they look like regular sort of Norway rats, but they live in the woods in the west coast of North America. And they build these elaborate structures out of sticks that have multiple rooms in them, and then those get inherited from one generation to the next. And it's part of what sort of can, if you're a wood rat who's born into a family that has a really good structure, you have a better life than a wood rat who's born into a family who has
so cool.
less.
I want to know more about these wood rats. That's awesome. I love rats to begin with. So this is...
But just like taking that again, like when you can start framing that as potentially architecture or culture, and using language that can bring into relief that importance rather than obscure it with sort of very pared down language that makes it's hard for us to see it from the outside how crucial these built environments can be when we describe them with incredibly neutral sort of like non-cultural language, basically. And so that language can actually help us see things more accurately, potentially, when we're talking about conservation and protection.
Yeah, absolutely. And I also repair, thinking about when you've got architecture, especially this multi-generational spaces, that the idea of repairing these things, I mean, this is just also really neat because I'm interested in normativity, and the idea of repair is like it would be better if it was like this. We're going to fix it. We're going to make it like it ought to be, and that's the way I've been looking at these structures. But who asked that question?
Tucker Kirchberg.
Tucker, yeah. So great. It's a really great question, and I hope you write a paper about it.
Yeah, and I think that was the last question. Oh no, there's more questions, sorry. Because I had one, oops. What was I gonna say? Oh yeah, since we're on this, I might just ask my own question here before we get to the final question. Are there more questions? Oh my gosh, I'm so bad at this. Okay, no, there's just one more question. This idea that like it doesn't count as culture if it's ecologically based for animals, but I think for humans that would just absolutely, that would be unrecognizable, because you think about cultures that are specifically oriented around the ecology of, you know, a fishing village, for example, or, you know, the integrating like the land and the environment as being part of the culture and even maybe a primary generating force for the culture. And that seems like that bar, I understand why it's there, because you want to think that it's coming from you know, from a social transmission rather than, you know, an environmental pressure. But it also seems like it can create blind spots for us thinking about what's important to animal lives.
Yeah, absolutely. That and the genetic
Yeah.
constraint as well in those definitions. Carl van Schaik and some others have a nice paper called Culture, We're Only Seeing the Tip of the Iceberg or something like that, that makes these sorts of points. And I have an unpublished paper with Adam Bebko on this sort of stuff as well, because it's very common to hear folks say, like people from the cultural evolution side of things say, there's no gene culture coevolution in non-human animals, this is human unique, you know, blah, blah, blah. Joe Henrich says this in The Secret of Our Success quite explicitly in a couple of papers. But we were looking at, you know, how else can you explain the sorts of differences you see in some species, like it was the wolves in Canada and the Pacific, and some are specialized for eating salmon and some aren't. And the ones who are specialized for eating salmon only eat part of the salmon. I think they don't eat their brain. I don't remember the details, and because it makes them sick. So this is an acquired behavior, but they also have specialized teeth for eating the salmon and so on. So they've got this genetic component too. So it's socially learned genetic component. And then when they introduced wolves from another area into there that didn't have the same genes, they didn't have the social knowledge, they ate salmon and they died because they ate them wrong. And it's just like Joe Henrich's example at the beginning of Secret of Our Success of the Europeans who go in and eat, I forget what it was, cassava or something, without pounding it and processing it properly, and died because they don't know how to eat it. They saw people eating it, and so they ate it, but they didn't process it right.
Yeah.
So if you're just playing by the same rules for the humans and the non-humans, you'd really want to say this is an example of gene culture coevolution.
Yeah, great. So the final question that we have here, and I have a question also that sort of rides on this one, is the question from Marcia Govinda Gladys Kondoy Turienke. Hello, my question is, can animal culture be considered part of biodiversity? And I have two sort of follow-on questions of that, is like maybe how can we sort of conceive of animal culture alongside of or as part of biodiversity? Like what would be sort of some markers? And then I guess also an observation that I'll mention if
okay. Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I think that, like, I would say, yes, animal culture is going to be part of biodiversity because of this intertwined nature that has been proposed if you take gene culture coevolution seriously and don't have a different standard for non-human animals. Then when you're preserving biodiversity, you're going to be preserving culture insofar as you also preserve the environment that the animals are able to express their culture in. Because, I mean, this is your point, Becca, about the ecological aspects. If you take away the ecology, you're not going to be able to, you know, engage in your culture. This is something we see in humans, right?
Yeah.
And part of the cultural genocide that happens in some human cultures when you take away the materials people need to do their traditional practices. Yeah, it's been very stark. This has been very stark to me, being in the UK, and all the traditional practices that just continue to be passed on, and like every, you know, basket weaving and the rushes and the collecting and the managing and the woodlands and stuff like this. And there's a lot of information and knowledge that was lost because of the cultural genocide in North America, and in Canada, the residential schools, which were continuing into the 1980s. I mean, it's just, yeah. So that's, you know, you need the environment, and you need the individuals being able to socially learn in order to continue and preserve the culture in a wild context. Now, in a captive context, I think that the questions will be interesting about how long cultures last. And one of the things we see in contemporary, like Western cultures, is that you'll have cultural trends that are very quick, right? So everybody's doing, you know, whatever, Ugg boots or whatever it is. And then next year, you're not doing that, you're doing something else. Or everybody's eating tater tots, you know, or whatever, you know, whatever the food fad is these days, that's what's happening. And then it's gone. And so it might be that in captive communities, you get a little bit more of cultures, like elements of that in the culture, especially if humans are coming in and saying, hey, look at this iPad, and introducing that to the community, and doing apps for apes or whatever. And that might be cool for a while, and then something else. I don't know if I'm answering the question exactly. The marker. Okay.
I think you are, and I think I mean the one thing I was sort of thinking about, and you've said this multiple ways, and then just another way of saying it that just occurred to me is that when we talk about biodiversity, maybe in a very strict reductive way, we're talking about genetics or something like that, or species, let's say. But then it makes me think about how we define species, and the way that we define species is, you know, animal populations that have that will mate with each other, basically. And so we know, for example, that dolphins and orca whales can mate and have viable offspring, but we consider them to be separate species because they don't mate with each other, you know, given the proper sort of, like, you know, autonomy and flexibility, they don't mate with each other. And then when in my days as an anthropologist, I remember learning about a group of I think they were lemurs or lorises that actually are genetically incredibly similar and potentially can mate with each other and have viable offspring, but they scent mark in different ways. And so they essentially are just passing each other in the night, even though they're living in the same place, because, you know, one scent marks with their wrist glands and the other one scent marks with their anal glands. And so, like, one group really doesn't care about anal gland scent marks and the other one only cares. So it's like, yeah. And so, you know, like, you could imagine that like that is like a learned practice potentially. I don't know that it is, but you could imagine a case in which it would be. And that is what actually defines what we are even talking about in a traditional sense of biodiversity and conservation, of what the definition of a species is that the culture of the animals is driving what is the definition of the species, even in a very traditional sense. So, and I think that it's such a powerful lens and way of thinking about it, to just bring all of that out and to take it seriously from these different biodiversity, captive animal welfare. It's very powerful.
Yeah, that's very interesting. That's a very interesting. I hadn't thought about the identifying, right? So species is a notoriously difficult concept to try to define and get at, especially because it's not static, right? Things are changing all the time. Every generation, things are changing. But the culture, I wonder if some of those traditional problems can be helped by thinking about culture as species. Yeah, that's an interesting idea.
Yeah.
Cool.
Well, Thank you so much. It's so lovely to hear this work, and it's so fresh and stimulating and exciting, and then also incredibly important for all of the, practical questions that we're facing today. So it's really just a delight, and we're so grateful that you took the time to come here to talk with us and share your work with us. So I'd like to just say thank you again to my co-panelists, Jeff and Mari, for setting this up in the Brooks Institute. And of course, Kristin Andrews, thank you so much, and happy Earth Day, everyone. Oh, and thank you to our wonderful audience. It's just been great to have these questions. It really enriched the whole thing. So
I want to say thanks for all the great questions. So it's been really, really lovely to hear you engage with the work, and what a nice audience and group you've got.
Yes, thank you, Kristin. Thank you, everybody. Happy Earth Day, and hope everybody has a great weekend.
Okay, bye.
Bye.